They say money talks, but in Chicago's financial district, sometimes it screams. On December 15, 1954, the most secure bank vault in the Midwest was robbed of $500,000 without a single door being forced, alarm being triggered, or guard being harmed. The thieves left behind something more valuable than what they took, a mystery that would challenge everything Detective Morrison thought he knew about the impossible. When bank robbers can walk through walls, when security systems fail without explanation, and when the only witness is a man who claims he saw ghosts in three-piece suits, the line between reality and madness becomes as thin as a banknote. Tonight, Morrison enters a world where the greatest heist in Chicago history might not have been committed by anyone who was actually there.
December 1954. Chicago's financial district was the beating heart of America's post-war economic boom. The city had recovered from the Depression, the war had been won, and money was flowing like never before. At the center of it all stood the Midwest Security Bank, a fortress of steel and concrete that housed the fortunes of politicians, industrialists, and crime bosses alike. The bank's president, Harrison Blackwood, had built his reputation on one simple promise: absolute security. The vault system was state-of-the-art, designed by the same engineers who had worked on military installations during the war. Time locks, pressure sensors, and a security staff that included former military police made the Midwest Security Bank virtually impregnable. But on the morning of December 15th, Blackwood's world came crashing down. The night shift security guard, Walter Kowalski, had discovered something that defied explanation. The main vault, secured by a time lock that couldn't be opened until 9 a.m., had been emptied of its most valuable contents sometime during the night. What made the robbery impossible wasn't just the security systems, it was the complete absence of any evidence that anyone had been there. No forced entry, no disabled alarms, no unconscious guards. The vault door remained locked, the time mechanism untouched, and the security logs showed no unusual activity. The stolen items weren't random. Someone had taken exactly what they came for. Bearer bonds worth $300,000, rare coins valued at $150,000, and a small safety deposit box belonging to Judge Theodore Hartwell, a man who had been dead for 3 years. Detective Morrison received the call at 10:15 a.m. Bank President Blackwood's voice was steady, but Morrison detected a tremor of a man watching his life's work crumble. "Detective, I need someone who can handle unusual cases. What happened here last night shouldn't be possible, but the money is gone and I need to know how." Morrison had dealt with seemingly impossible crimes before, but this one felt different. The precision of the theft, the specific items taken, and the complete absence of conventional evidence suggested something far more complex than a simple robbery. The Midwest Security Bank occupied 3 floors of a limestone building that had been constructed in 1928. The vault was located in the basement, behind steel doors that required 2 keys turned simultaneously and a combination known only to 3 people: President Blackwood, Vice President Margaret Sterling, and Head of Security Thomas Brennan. Morrison's first impression was of a crime scene that had been cleaned too well. Everything was in perfect order, too perfect. The marble floors gleamed, the brass fixtures sparkled, and there wasn't a fingerprint to be found on any surface. Walter Kowalski, the night security guard, was waiting in the vault antechamber. A 20-year veteran of bank security and former military police, Kowalski was not easily rattled. But his hands shook as he lit his third cigarette of the morning. "Detective," Kowalski said, his voice hoarse from chain smoking, "I've been working security for 2 decades. I've caught thieves, stopped robberies, and handled every kind of trouble you can imagine. But I've never seen anything like this. The vault was locked when I checked it at midnight, 2 a.m., and 4 a.m. At 6 a.m., I opened it for the morning inventory, and half the contents were gone." Morrison examined the vault door mechanism. The time lock was a masterpiece of engineering, a mechanical system that physically prevented the door from opening until the predetermined time. There was no way to bypass it without destroying the entire mechanism, and the mechanism showed no signs of tampering. Inside the vault, Morrison found the first real clue. The stolen items had been selected with surgical precision. Hundreds of safety deposit boxes remained untouched, while specific high-value items had been removed. But it was the pattern of the theft that caught Morrison's attention. The thieves had left behind items of equal or greater value. A collection of rare diamonds worth $400,000 sat untouched, while bearer bonds worth $300,000 had been taken. It wasn't about maximum profit, it was about specific items. Morrison discovered something else that troubled him. The vault's ventilation system had been tampered with. The air ducts were too small for human passage, but someone had been inside them recently. Fresh scratches on the metal and a faint odor of cologne suggested recent activity. But the most disturbing discovery was in the security office. The cameras that monitored the vault had malfunctioned between 2:15 and 2:45 a.m., recording nothing but static. The timing was too precise to be coincidental.
Morrison's investigation began with the 3 people who had access to the vault: President Blackwood, Vice President Sterling, and Head of Security Brennan. In bank robberies, the insider was often the key to the crime. Blackwood presented himself as the perfect bank president: conservative, reliable, and utterly committed to security. But Morrison discovered that Blackwood's personal finances were more complicated than his public image suggested. Blackwood had been investing heavily in post-war construction projects, and several of his investments had gone sour. He owed significant money to people who didn't accept late payments gracefully, the kind of people who might appreciate untraceable bearer bonds. "The security of this bank is my life's work," Blackwood told Morrison, but his eyes kept drifting to the phone on his desk. "I've never had so much as a penny go missing in 20 years of operations. This robbery is an attack on everything I've built." Morrison noticed that Blackwood had been working late every night that week, claiming to review year-end reports, but the cleaning staff reported seeing him in the basement levels near the vault on several occasions. More suspicious were Blackwood's recent meetings with Anthony Torino, a contractor with alleged mob connections. Torino's construction company had been awarded several city contracts under questionable circumstances.
Margaret Sterling was the highest-ranking woman in Chicago's financial district, a position she had earned through brilliant financial acumen and ruthless ambition. But Morrison discovered that Sterling's ambition extended beyond legitimate banking. Sterling had been conducting unauthorized currency exchanges with European clients, taking advantage of post-war economic fluctuations. The transactions were profitable but illegal, and she had been using the bank's resources to facilitate them. "I work twice as hard as any man in this building," Sterling told Morrison during their interview. "I've had to fight for every advancement, every opportunity, but I've never compromised the bank's security. My reputation depends on it." However, Morrison discovered that Sterling had been in contact with Judge Hartwell before his death 3 years earlier. The judge had been investigating financial irregularities, and Sterling had been one of his primary sources of information. The contents of Judge Hartwell's safety deposit box remained a mystery, but Sterling's nervousness when asked about it suggested she knew more than she was admitting.
Thomas Brennan had been head of security for 8 years, hired after a distinguished career with the Chicago Police Department. But Morrison discovered that Brennan's departure from the force hadn't been entirely voluntary. Brennan had been investigating police corruption when he was forced to resign. Several officers he had been investigating were later found to have connections to organized crime. Brennan's departure had been a condition of keeping certain information quiet. "I know every inch of this building," Brennan told Morrison, his voice carrying the bitterness of a man who had seen too much corruption. "Every system, every weakness, every way someone could get in. But I also know it's impossible to do what these thieves did." Morrison discovered that Brennan had been meeting regularly with former police contacts, including some who had been involved in the corruption investigation. The meetings were always in secret, always late at night. More troubling, Brennan had recently purchased a new car and had been making large cash deposits to his bank account. When asked about the money, he claimed it was from a deceased relative's estate, but Morrison could find no record of any inheritance.
Morrison's investigation expanded beyond the bank's walls to Chicago's underworld. A robbery this sophisticated required resources and expertise that went beyond ordinary criminals. Anthony Torino ran the most successful construction company in Chicago, but his success had less to do with building quality than with his ability to win contracts through intimidation and political connections. Torino had been expanding his operations into new territories that required significant upfront capital. The kind of capital that untraceable bearer bonds could provide. Morrison discovered that Torino had been asking questions about the bank's security systems, claiming to be interested in upgrading his own office building's protection. But his questions were too specific, too focused on the vault systems. "I'm a legitimate businessman," Torino told Morrison when questioned. "I build things, I employ people, I pay my taxes. I don't need to rob banks. I make more money legally than most thieves see in a lifetime." But Morrison learned that Torino had been under investigation by federal authorities for money laundering. The investigation had been quietly dropped after key witnesses had disappeared or changed their testimony.
Professor Edwin Blackthorne taught mechanical engineering at the University of Chicago, but his real passion was locks and security systems. He had written several papers on vault design and had consulted for banks across the Midwest. Blackthorne had been developing new security technologies, including time lock mechanisms that claimed to be absolutely foolproof. But Morrison discovered that the professor had been experiencing financial difficulties. The professor had been gambling heavily on horse races and had accumulated debts with the kind of people who collected payments in ways that didn't involve lawyers. The Midwest Security Bank's vault is a fascinating example of 1940s security technology, Blackthorne told Morrison with academic enthusiasm. But like all mechanical systems, it has vulnerabilities that a sufficiently motivated person could exploit. Morrison found blueprints of the bank's vault system in Blackthorne's office, far more detailed than what should have been available to an outside consultant.
Lucia Martinelli ran the Golden Horseshoe, Chicago's most exclusive underground casino. Her clientele included politicians, businessmen, and anyone with enough money to buy their way into her private games. Martinelli had been expanding her operations, but legitimate financing was difficult for someone in her profession. She needed capital that couldn't be traced, and bearer bonds were perfect for that purpose. Morrison discovered that several of the bank's employees, including security guards, had been spotted at the Golden Horseshoe. Martinelli was known for her ability to gather information from customers who talked too much after losing money. "I run a business based on trust," Martinelli told Morrison, her voice smooth as silk. "My customers know their secrets are safe with me. But I also know that information is valuable, and I'm always willing to pay for the right kind of information." Morrison found evidence that Martinelli had been mapping the schedules of bank employees, tracking their habits and vulnerabilities. She knew more about the bank's operations than most people who worked there. Morrison returned to the bank that evening, determined to understand how the impossible robbery had been accomplished. He had examined every suspect, every angle, every possible method of entry, but the crime remained incomprehensible. It was Walter Kowalski who provided the breakthrough. The night security guard had been reluctant to share one detail, afraid it would make him sound insane. But as Morrison prepared to leave, Kowalski grabbed his arm. "Detective," Kowalski whispered, looking around as if afraid of being overheard, "there's something I didn't tell you. At 2:30 a.m., I heard voices in the vault. Not alarms, not equipment. Voices. Men talking, laughing like they were at a party. But the vault was locked, and I was the only one in the building." Morrison asked Kowalski to recreate exactly what he had heard. The guard led him to the vault door and pressed his ear against the steel. At first, Morrison heard nothing. Then, faintly, he detected something that made his blood run cold. Voices. Muffled, but definitely voices. Men talking in what sounded like a casual conversation.
But the vault was empty, secured, and monitored. There was no way anyone could be inside. Morrison's detective instincts warred with his rational mind. He had spent years debunking supernatural explanations for seemingly impossible crimes, but the evidence was undeniable. He was hearing voices from inside a locked, empty vault. The voices faded after a few minutes, leaving Morrison and Kowalski in unsettling silence. But Morrison had heard enough to recognize something significant. One of the voices had a distinct Polish accent, another spoke with the refined tones of education, and a third had the rough cadence of a lifelong criminal. Morrison realized that the impossible robbery might not have been impossible at all. It might have been committed by people who were already dead.
Morrison's investigation took an unprecedented turn. If the voices in the vault belonged to dead men, then he needed to identify which dead men had the skills and motivation to rob the Midwest Security Bank. The first voice, with the Polish accent, led Morrison to Stanislaw Kowalski, Walter's brother, who had died in a construction accident 3 years earlier. But Stanislaw hadn't been a construction worker. He had been a safecracker, one of the best in Chicago. Stanislaw had been working on a legitimate construction job when a beam fell and killed him instantly. But Morrison discovered that Stanislaw had been planning one final heist before retiring, a heist that would target the most secure bank in the Midwest. The second voice, educated and refined, matched the speech patterns of Judge Theodore Hartwell. But Hartwell had been investigating banking irregularities when he died of a heart attack 3 years earlier. Morrison realized that Hartwell's death might not have been natural. Hartwell had been close to exposing a major financial conspiracy involving several of Chicago's most prominent banks. His safety deposit box at the Midwest Security Bank contained evidence that could destroy careers and send people to prison. The third voice, rough and criminal, belonged to Vincent Hammer Torino, Anthony Torino's brother, who had been murdered in a gang war 2 years earlier. Hammer had been a specialist in bank security, learning systems from the inside before exploiting them. Morrison realized that 3 dead men, a safecracker, a judge, and a security specialist, had somehow returned to complete unfinished business. But dead men don't rob banks, no matter how skilled they had been in life.
Morrison returned to the bank with a theory that challenged everything he thought he knew about criminal investigation. Walter Kowalski was waiting for him, but this time the security guard's nervous demeanor had been replaced by something more sinister. "You figured it out, didn't you, detective?" Kowalski said, his voice carrying none of the tremor Morrison had heard earlier. "You realized that the voices in the vault weren't ghosts. They were recordings." Morrison understood instantly. The impossible robbery had been an elaborate psychological operation designed to make everyone believe in the supernatural, while the real crime was committed by very living people. Kowalski had been planning the heist for 3 years, ever since his brother Stanislaw's death. He had recruited Margaret Sterling, whose financial expertise was needed to convert the stolen bonds, and Thomas Brennan, whose security knowledge was essential for bypassing the systems. The recordings of the dead men's voices had been made years earlier, when all three were still alive. Stanislaw had recorded his plans for the bank heist. Judge Hartwell had dictated his evidence of banking corruption, and Hammer Torino had described security vulnerabilities. The theft itself had been accomplished through a combination of inside knowledge and advanced technology. Sterling had provided the vault combination, Brennan had disabled the security systems, and Kowalski had used his brother's safe-cracking techniques to access the safety deposit boxes. But the conspiracy went deeper than theft. Judge Hartwell's safety deposit box had contained evidence of a money laundering operation involving the bank's president, Harrison Blackwood. The thieves had taken the evidence to protect Blackwood, who was paying them a percentage of the laundered money. Morrison realized that the impossible robbery had been designed to fail. The supernatural elements were meant to attract attention, to make the crime seem so mysterious that investigators would focus on the impossibility rather than the reality. But Morrison had seen through the deception. "Your brother's voice on that recording," he told Kowalski. "He mentioned your name, called you by a nickname only family would know. You couldn't resist using the real recordings, could you?" The confrontation ended when Morrison revealed that he had been recording their conversation. The federal authorities, alerted by Morrison's earlier investigation, were already surrounding the building.
The arrest of the Phantom Heist conspirators made headlines across the country. The case became a textbook example of how modern criminals could use technology and psychological manipulation to commit seemingly impossible crimes. Walter Kowalski received 20 years in federal prison for organizing the conspiracy. His use of his brother's voice recordings was seen as particularly cold-blooded, exploiting his grief for criminal purposes. Margaret Sterling cooperated with authorities and received a reduced sentence of 10 years. Her testimony revealed the extent of the money laundering operation and led to additional arrests throughout Chicago's financial district. Thomas Brennan's knowledge of police procedures had made him valuable to the conspiracy, but it also ensured he received the harshest treatment from his former colleagues. He was sentenced to 15 years and was transferred to a maximum security facility. Harrison Blackwood's involvement in the money laundering operation led to his arrest and the closure of the Midwest Security Bank. The bank's assets were seized by federal authorities, and its customers were transferred to other institutions. The stolen bearer bonds and rare coins were recovered from a safety deposit box at another bank registered under a false name. The Judge Hartwell evidence was turned over to federal prosecutors, leading to a major investigation of Chicago's banking industry. What Morrison had uncovered wasn't just a sophisticated heist, it was the tip of an iceberg of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the city's financial establishment. But Morrison's satisfaction with solving the case was tempered by a disturbing realization.
The technology used to create the ghost voices was far more advanced than anything he had encountered before. Someone had provided the conspirators with equipment that shouldn't have existed in 1954.
3 weeks after the arrests, Morrison sat in his apartment reviewing the case files. The phantom heist had been solved, but questions remained that troubled his detective's mind. The recordings of the dead men's voices had been too perfect, too detailed, as if they had been planning to be used after their deaths. Morrison had discovered that all 3 men, Stanislaw Kowalski, Judge Hartwell, and Hammer Torino, had died within 6 months of each other. The construction accident, the heart attack, and the gang murder had all been investigated by different departments, but Morrison saw connections that others had missed. Judge Hartwell's heart attack had occurred just days before he was scheduled to testify before a federal grand jury. The medical examiner's report mentioned an unusual chemical compound in his blood, but the investigation had been closed when no one pursued the anomaly. Hammer Torino's murder had been attributed to a gang war, but Morrison discovered that Hammer had been trying to go legitimate, working with federal authorities to expose money laundering operations. His death had eliminated a key witness. Stanislaw Kowalski's construction accident had occurred at a building owned by Anthony Torino. The beam that killed him had fallen from a crane operated by someone who disappeared immediately after the incident and was never found. Morrison realized that the 3 men hadn't died by coincidence. They had been murdered to prevent them from exposing the conspiracy. But their killers had underestimated Walter Kowalski's determination to honor his brother's memory and complete the heist.
Morrison's investigation took him back to the sealed bank, where federal agents were still cataloging evidence. What he found in Harrison Blackwood's private office changed everything he thought he knew about the case. Hidden behind a false wall was a private safe containing documents that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. The Midwest Security Bank had been laundering money for a network of criminals that included politicians, judges, and police officials. But the most shocking discovery was a letter written in Judge Hartwell's handwriting, dated the day before his death. In it, he detailed his discovery of the money laundering operation and named the people involved. The letter had been addressed to Walter Kowalski. Morrison realized that Walter Kowalski hadn't been driven by greed or brotherhood loyalty. He had been recruited by Judge Hartwell to expose the corruption. But when the judge was murdered, Kowalski had decided to take justice into his own hands. When Morrison confronted Kowalski in prison, the former security guard's facade finally crumbled. Judge Hartwell contacted me because he knew about my brother's skills, Kowalski confessed. He wanted to expose the corruption, but he needed evidence from inside the bank. When they killed him, I knew I had to finish what he started. The phantom heist had been an elaborate form of justice, using the supernatural element to ensure maximum publicity and investigation. Kowalski had known that a mysterious robbery would attract federal attention in a way that simple accusations never could. Morrison asked Kowalski about the advanced recording equipment. The answer revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Judge Hartwell had federal contacts, Kowalski said. They provided the equipment, hoping to use it to record confessions. But when the judge died, I adapted it for my own purposes. The Phantom Heist case closed with more questions answered than Morrison had expected. The federal investigation that followed led to the arrest of 37 people, including 2 judges, a police chief, and the mayor's chief of staff. Walter Kowalski's sentence was reduced to 10 years when prosecutors realized he had been working to expose the corruption. His cooperation led to the recovery of millions in laundered money and the dismantling of Chicago's most sophisticated criminal network. Morrison reflected on the case as he walked through the snow-covered streets. He had solved a crime that seemed impossible, but in doing so, he had discovered that the real impossibility was the depth of corruption that had infected his city. The ghosts in the vault had been recordings, but they had spoken truth from beyond the grave. Sometimes, Morrison realized, the dead could achieve more justice than the living ever could. As Morrison reached his apartment, he found a letter waiting for him. It was from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, offering him a position with their organized crime division. The Phantom Heist had been his last case as a Chicago detective. But that, as they say, is another story. For now, Detective Morrison had proven that even the most impossible crimes could be solved by a detective willing to listen to voices from beyond the grave, even when those voices came from a recording machine.